All right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome everyone who's attending. Welcome to The Lore of Bigfoot at the Bozeman Public Library with Joel Carlson. Some of you might know Jessica Carlson, one of our librarians here, who has recently moved on to bigger and different things, but she's still with us. I don't know if she'll be saying hi every now and then throughout the presentation, but Joel is her wonderful husband and our local Bigfoot enthusiast. So he's going to give a presentation, do a little bit of storytelling. And at the end, we'll have it open for Q&A. You might be able to see there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, so you can type in any questions you might have. We'll read them aloud at the end, and Joel will go through and answer them for you. If you have a question that'll be easier to explain verbally than in the Q&A, there's a little option to raise your hand, and you'll want to click that button so that we can go through and I'll unmute you once we get to that Q&A section. If that makes sense, let's get started. Welcome, Joel.
All right, thanks. So I will introduce the topic. I'll kind of give you a thesis here, and then I'll introduce myself just a little bit, and then get into some details. So we're obviously here to talk about what is commonly known as Bigfoot. That's more of a regional term, and as we'll talk about, this is actually a global phenomenon, which is a really interesting piece of evidence for supporting the existence of the animal, but we'll just use Bigfoot generically. I think that'll serve our purposes tonight. So I have a kind of a thesis for you all, and that's basically that you can be open to the possibility of the existence of this animal and be a pretty normal person at the same time. That's my thesis. So this is I want to bring some credibility just to the concept, because it is, generally speaking, very trivialized, very marginalized. Maybe professionals are somewhat slow to take the concept seriously. So what I'm going to share, if there are some other enthusiasts on here, you may know much more than me regarding some of the things I'm going to say and all of that, and that's great. I want to bring some credibility to the area, and if I can get people from there's no way this animal exists to okay, this is a possibility. If I can get them into that what I call open but cautious category, then I consider that a victory. So let me just introduce myself a little bit. I'm a lifelong Montanan. I was born in a little town called Chester, if anyone knows where that is. It's up on the High Line. Yeah, from Montana my whole life. Did 7 years in the Navy out of high school, and now I'm back in Montana, living and working in Bozeman. We've been here since 2012. 3 kids, soon to be 4. So I have a steady job. I'm married to my wife, and things are going pretty okay. All that to say, our lives are fairly typical or normal, and we kind of have this Bigfoot hobby thing just for fun. So let me talk about that a little bit. I have been into what you might call the more unknown. I've just been drawn to mystery since I was a kid. I remember when I grew up in the Missoula area mostly, and I remember when Barnes and Noble opened on North Reserve, and that was such a big deal. And I remember the first book I bought was this big hardcover book called The Unexplained, and so that would have been like early 90s, mid 90s, and big section of Bigfoot in there. And that's what first intrigued me. And so from then, I wouldn't say I've been an enthusiast until recently, kind of recent years. There's a tiny college up near Augusta, Montana, where I teach 1 week a year. And a couple of students there heard that I was kind of into Bigfoot. They said, "Hey, would you talk to a few of us students tonight about this? We'd like to hear your spiel." I said, "Sure." And like 45 students showed up. So just in my kind of friend circles or social circles, I've become known as something of a Bigfoot apologist. And so this is the first time I've ever shared anything publicly. So again, 30,000 foot view, largely introductory, trying to help people be just open to the concept, really. So what I'm actually talking about here, when people say, "Oh, you think you saw Bigfoot," we refer to the animal as if there's like one hairy guy running around the entire planet. And if you're lucky, you might catch a glimpse of Bigfoot, as if there's one. And so I just want to clarify a couple terms as I start. What I am promoting is the idea that there is a breeding population of bipedal, on two legs, apes on the continent of North America, U.S. and Canada. But we will talk globally a little bit as well. But I just that this is viable. That there could be a breeding population, probably relatively small population, admittedly, but a small breeding population of upright apes on our continent. So when I talk about Bigfoot, I'm not just talking about one. So that's just a common misconception I wanted to address straight away. So I'm going to walk you through a few arguments that I think are somewhat compelling for the existence, and then I'm just going to share some resources with you that have been helpful to me at the end. So, and then we are going to have some Q&A as well. The first thing I like to tell people when you're talking about Bigfoot is that if a body was brought into the Smithsonian tomorrow, dropped down on the front desk, here's your Bigfoot, no longer any debate, here it is. If that were to happen, strictly speaking, it would not be an entirely new advent for the scientific community. It would not be a totally novel concept. And I think this is important. I want to tell you why. Strictly speaking, if that were to happen, it would be more in the category of what's called a Lazarus species. Now, a Lazarus species, using the term Lazarus taken from the Christian New Testament, Lazarus was raised to life, right? So a Lazarus species is a species of animal that science thought was extinct. We know did exist, thought this has been extinct for a while, and then we're surprised to learn, oh wait, no, it's not. So an example, I'll give you a couple examples. One example would be the coelacanth. The coelacanth is a fish that scientists believe died out a long time ago, until a woman caught one while fishing off the coast of, I think, South Africa. In like the 1920s, she caught a coelacanth, and now there are coelacanth in aquariums all over the world. We thought it was gone. It's not gone. There's a species of stick insect that we also thought was gone until somewhere in the South Pacific, like one of these rocks jutting straight up out of the water, there's a bush growing out the side of the rock, and they found one colony of like 12 of these huge stick insects living in that bush. And so that's a Lazarus species. We thought it was gone. It's not. Even recently, there have been eyewitness reports of what was known as the Tasmanian tiger, right down in southern Australia and in Tasmania. The last one was supposed to have died in captivity, I think, in the 1950s. If that sounds familiar. At any rate, farmers are claiming to be seeing them again. So that would be a Lazarus species. So the reason that I say Bigfoot would be a Lazarus species is because the largest ape bones known to science belong to a species that has been called Gigantopithecus. Maybe you've heard that term. These bones are found in East Asia at first anyway. And so we have the bones, at least partially, of this. And notice I'm not saying fossils, I'm saying bones. So we're not talking necessarily distant history. Bones of an ape that they estimate was between 8 and 10 feet tall. That's pretty significant. Now here's an interesting thing about Gigantopithecus. Every known ape species right now, the spinal column enters in the back of the head, the back of the skull. So they're quadrupeds. They're down on all four. Gigantopithecus has an exceptionally wide jaw, and so there is tremendous reason to believe, much more like a human-shaped jaw. So that there's a lot of reason to believe that Gigantopithecus actually had a spinal column that entered in, not from the back of the skull, but from underneath, like ours, suggesting that it's a biped, that it was a bipedal 8-foot ape. So with all that said, the concept of an 8 to 10 foot ape on two legs is not far-fetched, and it's actually quite plausible that this animal did exist as described. So The question is not really, is this possible that this animal did exist? It most likely did. The question is, could it still exist in pockets, in probably nomadic breeding populations that are on the fringes of human contact? Could it still? Is really what the question is. I just think that's an important place to start, because the concept is so far-fetched for some people. But when you take a look, just scientifically speaking, empirical evidence, oh, this animal looks like something very similar to what is described as Bigfoot, did live, and not too distantly, and could it still? I believe that all signs point to yes, that this animal does still exist. And so let me get into that case just a little bit. So when I'm talking about, when I'm making a case, I kind of have three areas I like to address, and I'll go through these, and then we'll cruise into any questions. And if I don't have any good answers, which is not just plausible but probable, I'll make something up and try to sound convincing. The first case I like to make is the historical case, which I think is significant. When I mention the historical case, and if you see me glancing down here, I've got some notes I jotted down on a 3x5 before I started. When I talk about the historical case, I'm talking just in terms of our continent. There is tremendous historical testimony from our own Native American peoples, and in Canada, the First Nations people of Canada, parts of Canada. Tremendous historical testimony, especially up and down the coast of British Columbia, parts of Alberta, the Pacific Northwest. You'd be hard pressed to find a people group, a tribe of people, First Nations or Native American people. You'd be hard pressed to find a group of them who don't have a spot for this animal in their own story. It's not uncommon at all to hear about animals that are considered sacred: the eagle next to the elk, next to the bear, next to the brown man, the brown hairy man, whatever word they might have for it. And every language typically has its own word for this creature. So that's quite significant, that in many places, when it comes to the people who have been on this continent longest, it's not even doubted or second guessed in many places. That's significant. When you have a culture of people who have the historical credibility saying, yes, we've always known about this, here's how we've interacted with it, that's worth a listen. We have to be really slow to discard that. And I'm going to share a resource at the end. If you're interested largely in the historical case, I have a really dynamite resource that I want to commend to you. So that's part of it. Leif Erikson apparently journaled about these animals when he landed on our continent ages ago, and he wrote about them in detail. I've not read that account, a copy of that account firsthand yet. I've just read summaries of it, but it sounds pretty fascinating. So there is the historical case, and not just on our continent, but it really is a global phenomenon, which anytime there's a global phenomenon, that's really worth taking a harder look at, saying, okay, this isn't isolated to a pocket of people in this one region. You have historical people groups all over the planet that have a similar story, suggesting that this animal not only existed but was more widespread in various forms or family groups or whatever. So let me just give you a couple examples. We use the term Bigfoot. That's a pretty American term. That's kind of a Pacific Northwest and Northern California term. But there's the Yeren in China. There's the Yeti, of course, with which you're probably familiar with that term. The Yowie in Australia. Then I wrote down some that I was not even familiar with or hadn't read in a while. The Moaha in New Zealand. The Wendigo in Canada. Maybe you've heard that term. The Uraguli in Alaska. The Uku in Chile and Argentina. And the orange pendek in Indonesia. And that's just to name a few. Siberia has its own version and its own word for this animal. I mean, all over the place, different parts of the continent of Africa. This is not isolated to the Pacific Northwest, which is kind of more our wheelhouse, and Montana as well. Not to the same degree, but yeah, there are tremendous sightings in Montana. I'll get there in just a moment. But at any rate, all that to say, there is an historical case to be made for the existence of this animal. And actually, I'll just plug this book right now. Actually, I was recommended, I think it was on a podcast, I was recommended this book It's called Abominable Snowmen: Legend Come to Life. It's like, I know it's like super 60s, you know. Ivan Sanderson is the author, and I was really surprised by this book, just at the quality, at the depth of research he did, and he makes a global historical case. I mean, he's talking. He goes back to the mid 1800s, citing British military, official military reports where they're building power lines over mountain ranges, and they encounter something, and Captain so-and-so files an official report. We saw this animal. We don't know what it is. The locals have a name for it, that sort of thing. So Abominable Snowmen: Legend Come to Life is really good. And he goes all over the world, and with these documented accounts back to the, like I said, back to the mid 1800s. And what's interesting about that is that the Bigfoot craze, Bigfoot making his way into pop culture, wasn't really a thing until like the 60s, when late 50s, early 60s, I think, when the term was Bigfoot was actually coined by a newspaper. So this is before the phenomenon made its way into pop culture. This was published in like 1961, I think. So really fascinating if you're interested in the historical argument, because it's there. I mean, the stories in this are fascinating, and you've got to either come to terms with those stories and say, yeah, maybe there's something there, or you have to say all of these people are liars, or they're delusional, or it's a mass hallucination or something. You've got to come up with some sort of explanation when entire towns like Fouke, Arkansas. Maybe you remember the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek. Go to Fouke, Arkansas, and try to tell people that a creature really wasn't plaguing their town for months on end. I mean, try it. I mean, it won't work, because people lived it. I mean, they were there, they saw, they all experienced this. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Dynamite book. Yeah. Abominable Snowmen: Legend Come to Life by Ivan Sanderson. Can't recommend it highly enough. So there is a tremendous historical case, all that said. And if you do some digging, there's really no shortage of historical arguments to be made. But let me move on to just what I call the evidential case, or the empirical case. Though we are quick to dismiss empirical evidence when it comes to this animal, I don't think we should. When you're just thinking, when you're thinking logically, thinking rationally, there is a tremendous amount of physical evidence for these animals, primarily in kind of three areas. Eyewitness accounts is its own category. I talk about that later, but audio, footprints, tracks, and hair samples. All three of these kinds of evidence exist in abundance, and they really do exist in abundance if you're willing to go look for it. Again, mainstream science is hesitant to get on board with the concept of this animal, because I think people don't want to be lumped in with the pop culture Bigfoot crowd, right? Bigfoot and UFOs and Loch Ness, right? Like, they all go hand in hand. And I'm not speaking to UFOs or Loch Ness, but I do think there's we're talking about Bigfoot tonight. I think there's a lot more to Bigfoot. So I mean, audio. There are awesome audio recordings going back from. There's a specific recording called the Sierra Sounds. Maybe you've heard those. If not, write that down. You might want to check those out later. Though the Sierra Sounds are eerie. They're unnerving to me. If I'm remembering the story correct, and forgive, I'm just oversimplifying, so forgive me. But this man in the Sierra Nevadas was told, go to this part of the mountain range, you'll encounter these animals, way off trail by himself. And this was back in, I think, the 70s, the 60s or the 70s, but armed with just a bunch of tape recorders. He just kept changing out the tapes and was recording all night, all around where he was camping. And he got like minutes and minutes of this audio from these animals that were basically calling back and forth and interacting. And some of it, and this is why I use the word unnerving, some of it almost sounds like chatter. I mean, it's really creepy. But the whoops, there are some whoops in there that are very typical, like if you've heard other kinds of ape species. But what the interesting thing about the Sierra Sounds is that those audio files were analyzed by the University of, I think, Wyoming, if I'm remembering right, the University of Wyoming Audiology Department. And they concluded two things. One is that these tapes have not been tampered with. And two is that whatever is making the sound is beyond human vocal capacity. They could definitively say this is not a human And these tapes are legitimate. They're genuine. We don't know. They didn't say what was making the noise, but they said what is not making the noise. So the Sierra Sounds, and there's countless others. There's a guy, he just passed away. He was kind of a big name in this field of cryptozoology and Bigfoot specifically. I can see his face in my mind. He's been in a number of documentaries, John something, I think, but he was big in Washington State and captured a number of really awesome recordings. And I will tell you where you can find some of those at the end as well. There's a couple podcasts that have some pretty good stuff. But again, these audio recordings that are just echoing off of mountains, they're not coming from people. You can't say definitively what they are coming from. But locals are saying, hey, we know what's making that noise, and so maybe we ought to listen to them. So there's quite a bit of audio evidence if you look for it. The tracks are interesting because there are actually quite a lot of tracks that are found and cast and recovered. It's easy for the skeptic to say, well, that's easy. That's just a guy who took a piece of plywood and cut out the shape of a foot and strapped it to his boots and stomped around in the snow. And that's a pretty shallow, that's a pretty primitive concept of these tracks. If you're able to look at anything regarding these tracks, they are immaculate. They are detailed. You can see ridges and the way that the feet are flexing, the way the toes are landing. There's a man, you may know his name. He's at University of Idaho, Pocatello. His name is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. And people don't know what to do with him because he's a very credible scientist and doctor. And yet he is into the Bigfoot phenomenon, and he is trying to bring credibility to this area of research. He has, don't quote me on this, I believe he has the largest collection of footprint castings in the world, if memory serves. And I was watching one documentary with him, and he's trying to make the case that yes, some footprints can be faked, and some of them are. He's got good enough at looking at them. He can tell, oh, this is a duplicate of one we already have. So someone took an existing cast and did another one. Oh, this one's brand new. Oh, this one's clearly fake. Whatever. He brings out one track in one of these documentaries I watched, and he presents it, to the documentary team. And here's what's interesting. The footprint was brought in, if I'm remembering right, like in the 1940s or 50s by a farmer. I don't remember where. But brought in by a high school educated farmer in the 40s or 50s. 17-inch track. I mean, it's a big track, And so the thought that this is fake, Dr. Meldrum looks at it. He says, listen, he says, I can look at this track and definitively tell you it's an ape track. He said, let me tell you why. He's showing you about the dermal ridges that are characteristic to ape feet, these sorts of things. But the big giveaway was, humans, our feet break on the ball of the foot. That's where they flex, is on the ball of the foot. Apes have what's called a mid-tarsal break. Their foot actually flexes just in front of the heel. So it actually flexes in a totally different spot. So their feet land differently. You can see the mid-tarsal break in a clear track. So he's looking at this track brought in by a high school educated farmer in the 40s or 50s saying, I can see the mid-tarsal break. Explain to me how a high school educated farmer would have the knowledge base and the skill to accurately reproduce that. And why would he want to, pre-Bigfoot craze? Why would he put his reputation on the line for something like that? It makes no sense. He said, logically, I have to conclude that this is an ape track. And yes, it also happens to be 16 to 17 inches long. So all that to say, be slow to discount the tracks, because experts are looking at them and saying, we have no reason to think that these are illegitimate. We have only reason to think that they're real. So I think the tracks are very interesting. And hair samples as well. These are brought in all the time. There's no shortage of examples where hair samples are brought in. I just read a news story out of coastal Oregon, tracks with a hair sample in them, and pretty consistently these hair samples come back. If they're not a known animal, like, oh, that happened to be a bear or an elk or whatever, they often belong to the primate class generally, but nothing specifically cataloged. So that happens more often than you think. So there are a number of kind of outstanding hair samples out there that they don't know how to categorize because they've never found anything like them. So those do exist. Again, if you do a little digging, it's not hard to uncover at all. Credible DNA labs that are doing these tests and concluding, yeah, we don't know what this is. So on top of all that, now I move on to just what I call the eyewitness case. And I personally think the eyewitness case is powerful. One question I get along is, well, why doesn't anybody see these animals? And I say they do. They do. There are databases online of registered encounters and sightings. One of them is the BFRO website, the Bigfoot Field Research Organization. There are thousands of documented encounters in some way, shape, or form on that website. And you don't just get on and plug in your own encounter. They actually send a regional representative to interview you. Can you take them back to the spot? These sorts of things. So there are groups trying to bring credibility to the notion that these animals probably do exist in pockets. Again, probably nomadic, probably mostly nocturnal, and probably kind of pushed to the fringes of human contact, which would explain why there's an abundance of sightings in British Columbia and Alberta specifically. So anyway, the eyewitness case, yeah, there are thousands registered online. And again, historical and really fantastic eyewitness accounts going back to the mid 1800s that are documented. That again, we've got to do something with those. Are some of them hoaxes? Yeah, probably. Some of them are probably fabrications. Sure. Do you think it's logically likely or even possible that they are all hoaxes or that they are all fabrications? I don't. And the reason I don't, I'll share this now, is maybe you know someone who has a story of their own to tell. I can think of a couple of people who I have interacted with personally off the top of my head. I won't share their names because I didn't get permission ahead of time to do that. But when credible people say, yeah, I've got a story to tell, and then they tell that story, they're looking you in the eye, completely sober-minded. What are you going to say to them? Nope, sorry, you're mistaken. I mean, what are you going to say? So there's a man, he lives in the area. Some of you might know his name if I shared it. I'll say that he is he's a very highly respected medical professional who has done well for himself here in the Valley in Bozeman. And he told me, first I mentioned Bigfoot in front of his wife, and his wife said, oh, you need to go talk to my husband about that. So I did. And he kind of skeptically, why do you want to know? You want to make fun of me, sort of thing. I said, no, I'm really interested. I'd love to hear your story. He told me that when he was going to Montana State here in the late 70s, that he had spent a weekend skiing down the canyon, down at Big Sky. And he said he was driving back on a Sunday night after dark through the canyon. And he said that this animal ran right in front of his car on 191 and that he nearly hit it, but he said he got a perfectly good look at it in the headlights. He said, I think it was a Bigfoot. And I said, well, what makes you think it was a Bigfoot and not something else? And this guy's born and raised in Montana as well. And we know our flora and fauna. We know our animals. He looked me in the eye and said, whatever it was the size of a moose on two legs. And I'm not going to laugh at that. I'm not going to joke about that. Why would I? This man has only given me reason to believe him in every other area of life. I know him. I know his family. I know where he goes to church. He's a pretty normal dude. And so I've got to do something with that when he shares that with me. So when you take the eyewitness account, you couple it with there is existing physical evidence. There is audio, there are footprints, there are DNA samples, and you have the historical credibility of Native tribes and First Nations people saying, yes, we've known about this for ages. You couple all that together, and you've actually got a scientific case for the existence of this animal. That's just one story. I've got another one, and again, I won't reveal the name, but we are closely connected with a family who has a relative up in northwest Montana, and this particular person just last summer was hiking with her nephew who was home on leave from the army, and they were hiking in Glacier, and they got back to their car very late, and they were driving back to where they're both from the area, and so they were driving back to home, and they were on kind of a back road, from what I understand. They told me specifically where. I don't even know if I ought to share that, but she said that, when you can kind of in your periphery see an animal's about to cross the road, and so you pump your brakes and all this, and so they were not on a highway. They, like I said, they were on more of a back road. Here comes an animal, and she hesitated to use the word Bigfoot. I think because, again, there's a stigma attached to that. Am I going to lump myself in with the Bigfoot crowd, right? But she said this animal walked out on two legs. It was covered in hair, and it had a monkey face. She said it had a monkey face, and it stared at our car for a few seconds, and then kept going into the woods. So, and if I were to tell you who this woman was, she is a very well-respected woman in her community, very looked up to in her own profession. So there are all kinds of eyewitness accounts from perfectly credible people. Let me tell you one more, and I forget his name. I should have looked it up again before we did this. He just retired fairly recently from the Park Service, worked in Yellowstone. You may have seen this story. I don't know. I forget his name, but he was a career ranger in Yellowstone. And as memory serves, he was a backcountry ranger. So he would go on like these 2-week trips through the backcountry on horseback to kind of, to patrol for poachers and that sort of thing. And he was quite well known because he'd made his career there. People see Ranger so-and-so, again, I forget his name, but they want their photo with him. He's well known in the area. He retired, and then he released a statement just recently saying, now that I'm retired and disconnected from the park, I feel like I can tell my story. And he told his story about how when he was in the backcountry, he saw a bunch of mule deer bust out of some brush, as memory serves, and his horse started acting the way it does when there's a grizz nearby. So he's thinking, okay, here comes a bear out of the brush tearing after these deer, but it didn't. He said something did come out of the brush. It wasn't a bear. He said it was roughly the size of a grizz, but he said it was on two legs, and he watched it, tear off after these deer. So again, eyewitness testimonies are valid evidence in a court of law, right? Why are they not valid evidence when we're talking about thousands and thousands of eyewitness accounts for this kind of animal all over the U.S. and Canada? I think that's a good question. I think we've got to have a good answer for that. And could it be that we're not open to what's right in front of our faces in many ways? Let me tell you, and I should have mentioned this earlier when we were talking about evidence. One of the biggest questions that gets asked is, where's the Bigfoot body? Show me the dead body. And as far as resources go, I don't know if you know the name Les Stroud. He had his show. He's a Canadian guy. He had his show called Survivor Man. He had this show Survivor Man, showing you how to survive in different parts of the world, whatever. He had an interesting encounter when he was in Alaska one time, that he didn't know what to make of. The locals told him, well, yeah, that's Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever. So as kind of a skeptic, he dedicated season 6 of his show to investigating the Bigfoot phenomenon, which is pretty cool. And he found some really interesting stuff. I highly recommend season 6 of Survivor Man. You can buy it on Amazon. Again, Les is a very rational thinker, very scientifically minded, and he finds some interesting stuff through the series of season 6. Highly recommend it. But he talks about the body issue, and a point he makes, even from a more skeptical standpoint. He said, people say, show us the body. Where's the dead, Sasquatch? And he said, that's really not even an issue. He said, and here's why. He said, if these animals exist, he said a generous estimate of their numbers on our continent would be maybe 8 to 10,000 breeding individuals. That's a generous estimate, maybe 8 to 10,000 breeding individuals. He said, now think about black bears. He said, there are several 100,000 black bears we know in the US and Canada, okay? Several 100,000. He said, for all my time in the woods, I have never stumbled upon a rotting black bear carcass. You don't just trip over dead grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions, extremely rare. Reason being, those apex predators, when they're going to die, they typically know it. They go crawl in some deep dark hole in the woods, they die, and scavengers in the woods takes care of their body in no time flat. That's with an animal like black bears that you can drive to the Sourdough Canyon trailhead, and on any given day you'll see one rummaging in the dumps near the dumpster there. So it's not uncommon to see a black bear, but you never find their bodies. I'm a hunter. I spend quite a bit of time in the woods. I've never found a major predator body either. So he said if we're dealing with an animal of a fraction the population size, 10,000, of a much higher intelligence, pushed to the fringes of human contact, yeah, we should not expect to find a body. That's actually not an issue at all. It would be highly improbable that we stumble across a Bigfoot body just laying there decomposing. So that's an interesting part of the evidence. Let me kind of end with this. I think this is maybe the last kind of important piece when it comes to eyewitness accounts. You've probably seen what's called the Patterson Gimlin footage. If you haven't seen the footage, you've certainly seen a freeze frame of it. It's that famous freeze frame of this Bigfoot at the creek bottom, kind of glancing back at the camera as it's walking, right? This is quite interesting to me. There's a documentary called, I think it's called The Truth Behind Bigfoot. And I think the Discovery Channel did it, or some big name like that. Well, it's a documentary about that footage, specifically about the footage itself. And they got an original reel of the film from I think let's see, Bob Gimlin is still alive, so I think it was Patterson's widow still had the reel of film. She turned it over, and they had an imagery specialist take a high def photo of every single frame of film and recreate it perfectly stabilized in high def, all of that. What the documentary team did, they wanted to determine, what are we dealing with here? So they took that footage to Jim Henson's animatronics studio in California. Because what's the common sentiment when someone talks about Bigfoot? Oh, it's a guy in a monkey suit, right? Okay. So they took it to Jim Henson. These are some of Hollywood's finest when it comes to costumes, animatronics. Is this a man in a monkey suit? Was the question. Jim Henson's people looked at it and said, we don't think so. Why don't you think so? They said, well, this footage was shot when? Like 1967, 67 or 68. I think it was 67. They said this footage was shot in 67. They said, we're looking at this and we're seeing muscle groups flex. We're seeing body parts work together in perfect synchronization. They said, think about 1967. The best Hollywood could do in 1967 was the old Planet of the Apes movies, the straight, ridiculous hair with like the big like plastic muzzle, remember? That's what Hollywood was capable of in 1967. They said, whatever we're looking at here seems to be organic. Again, the muscle groups, we didn't have full body costume capabilities like this. So if this is a costume, it's technology that Hollywood was unaware of, which is, again, highly unlikely, right? So we don't think it's a costume. Now that's kind of the first aspect. The next thing that was fascinating, they actually flew in via helicopter to Bluff Creek, California, where that footage was shot, and they did a 3D scan of the entire creek bottom, and they recreated it all digitally. Now they know where the camera was, they know where the subject was, Bigfoot or not, they know where the subject was, and this is fascinating. Back then, no one owned a video camera. You wanted to film something, you rented one of those big boxy ones with the rotating lens on the front, right? Like 55 millimeter, 35 millimeter, whatever. So because they knew with which millimeter lens they were filming, and they knew where they were filming from and where the subject was, they were able to just plug in basic geometry and determine how tall the subject in the frame is, whether it's a person in a costume or not. And indisputable, according to math, whatever is in the frame is 7.5 feet tall. That's pretty interesting. So you've got something 7.5 feet tall in costume technology that did not exist at the time, if it's a costume. So the last thing they did was study the gait with which the subject walked. It walks in a way that's very unnatural for humans. So they actually hired a 7-foot tall body actor in California, and they put like one of the body tracing suits on with all the like foam balls on, and they tried for hours to get him to replicate that stride, that gait, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it for more than a couple steps at a time because it was so unnatural for a human. But whatever's doing it in the frame maintains that stride for like 40 seconds all the way across the creek bottom and then up the hill. So anyway, and that they just kind of leave it. They don't say, and so Bigfoot exists. They just kind of leave you to make your own conclusion. So I thought that was one of the more exceptional documentaries, and I commend it to you. Again, I believe that one was called The Truth Behind Bigfoot. Yeah, I think the Discovery Channel put that out. It's on Prime or Netflix or one of those, at least it was. Season 6 of Survivor Man, really, really good. He less attaches himself to different characters kind of in the Bigfoot world in every episode, and just kind of shadows them, tags along with them on their investigations. Some episodes come up totally empty-handed. Some of them come up with some really fascinating stuff. So I would encourage you to watch that as well. Again, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life by Ivan Sanderson. Can't recommend this enough. And again, if nothing else, because of when it was published, this was pre-Bigfoot in mass pop culture. So that's what interests me most. And detailed eyewitness accounts, really good stuff. If you're into podcasts, I'll give you just a couple. I really enjoyed the Sasquatch Chronicles is pretty good. If you can tolerate that guy's super Midwest accent. I'm just kidding. For all you Midwesterners, you're great. People got to eat, so we love your corn. But that's a good one. And people call in with all kinds of really good eyewitness accounts. Some of them, if you're a bit discerning, I think you can kind of, boy, that doesn't sound credible. Some of them are really fascinating. So the Sasquatch Chronicles is great. There's another one called Into the Fray that I enjoy listening to. Not all of those are Bigfoot and Sasquatch related, but there's a good number of them that are. And again, in those, a lot of times in the show notes, they have links to a lot of the audio recordings and stuff that they're talking about. So Into the Fray, that host is Shannon LeGros. And then Sasquatch Chronicles, I forget that guy's name. I think it's Wes something, but you can pull him up on any of your, podcatchers or whatever apps you use. So those are some resources. That's the 30,000 foot view. Again, a lot of you listening might have more information than I do. Again, I'm just an enthusiast, but it is a fun hobby. I love the mystery. I love the idea that we don't know everything about the natural world. And it's quite humbling to think that there could be these animals out there somewhat under our noses that have gone yet undiscovered. I think that's fascinating. I personally hope that the species is never officially discovered because I enjoy the mystery, but at the same time, I would love to see one. That's just where I'm at personally. But at any rate, it is now 7:43. I've been talking for a while, and I wonder if there are questions. I can pull up. I'll just pull up what do you think? Should I just pull up the Q&A?
Sure. Can I start maybe? And while we have people either typing in the Q&A or maybe raising their hands, like we said earlier, that would be super great if you had some questions. So you said something about Arkansas earlier, the town of what?
Fouke.
What
Fouke.
is it?
Fouke. I think there's an E on the end, but it's Fouke, Arkansas.
Okay. All right, just for checking things out. And Sierra
Yeah.
Sounds, is that something? Where would you find that?
YouTube has got some stuff put together on that, and that guy went on to write some books as well. But if you just Google the Sierra Sounds, it should pop right up.
Okay. And then so one thought I had was, so you refer to them as animals. The whole time you were talking, you said animal.
Mhm.
And so I'm just wondering that if the thought overall with scientists or with non-believers or whatever, however, is because they're so humanoid. I mean, I don't know. Like maybe people think, oh, there's this other human race in the woods or something. So it's
Right.
kind of interesting that you, throughout your talk, refer to them as animals. I thought that was very interesting because I thought people were always thinking this is like, oh, there's this hairy man in the forest,
Yeah.
So
Which there probably are some hairy men in the forest at any given time.
Yes.
But I'm glad you brought that up. There's actually a spectrum. That's a good point. There's a spectrum of what people believe about Bigfoot. Some people are, and I would be in the camp way over here of like, this is strictly biological, yet to be proven ape species. Other people are more, it goes as far over as like, I'm not making this up, like Bigfoot is working with the aliens and is an interdimensional being that can teleport stuff. So there's that end of the spectrum as well. And then there's a lot of in between. And a lot of Native American and First Nation stories have to do with almost viewing Bigfoot as like an elder brother sort of tribe. So there is a lot of talk of more almost like equals. So that is a position that some people do hold. So yeah, that's worth mentioning. Absolutely.
Yeah. So Brianna, do you want to read out the questions?
Sure. The first one that I see here in the chat says, have you read any of the missing 411 books? This one came a little bit earlier when you were talking about that book, Abominable Snowman.
Yeah. I've not even heard of those, but I'm going to write that down because that interests me. I'm always on the lookout for new resources. So no, I've not even heard of those.
All right. And the next one is, our attendee says, I think you proved your opening thesis. And his question is, what would be gained if a Bigfoot was discovered and what would be lost?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. What would be gained is I think what would be gained is that the scientific community would have to reevaluate how they handle evidence, how they approach cryptids, because the broader scientific community would have rejected this notion for so long. It would be quite embarrassing, honestly, for them. So I think that the professional scientific community would have to rethink some of the lore, some of the myths, some of that, maybe give more serious attention to how they handle circumstantial evidence as well as the physical evidence. I don't know what would be gained. I can only speak personally. Again, I would be a little sad, honestly, if it was definitively discovered, just because I enjoy the mystery. At the same time, I think what could be gained is maybe protection for the animal. I think if it exists, it's certainly endangered. I mean, I think we're dealing with a relatively low population. So I think that there could be tremendous progress just in terms of zoology and biology, and just in encountering a more advanced, if it is intelligence in the animal world. Again, I'm taking the animal spectrum of things, but so yeah, it could mean a lot for science. It would take away some of the intrigue for me a little bit, but at the same time, it'd be nice to have answers. Learning, man, how do these things live, and where do they live, and how do they communicate, and do they have patterns, with which they travel, stuff like that. So it'd be kind of a win and a loss, in my opinion. I'm sure a lot of other people would have different opinions on that. That's just me.
All right. So we have another question. It says, do you think Bigfoot is a predator to humans, or do you think they want to harm humans, or are they just afraid of us?
I think, and this is just based on, obviously, on what I've read, I think that they are very cautious of people. There are very, very few that I've read. And again, maybe there's other stuff out there. There are very few hostile interactions with people that I've read. There is one guy in this, again, this would be just across the way from Vancouver Island on mainland BC. There's this guy in like the 1880s who claims to have been snatched by one, like while he was in his sleeping bag, like straight up thrown over the shoulder and carried up to a high plateau where there was like a whole clan of them living. And even then they didn't seem like they were more intrigued by him than aggressive toward him. And if the story's true, he found out they were really interested in his box of snuff. And so he popped the lid and kind of threw it over here. And while they were all kind of, checking it out, he stole away. So no, very few, the most aggressive sorts of encounters that I've heard about, they will try to warn people away or scare people away, either vocally or a very common stuff getting thrown into your camp sort of thing, like campfire, camper sort of situation, tent sort of situation, rocks, bigger sticks thrown into your campsite in the middle of the night. That's probably the most common, I guess, aggression. There is one story that just popped in my mind near Salmon, Idaho, that President Theodore Roosevelt actually retold because he was acquainted with the guy with whom it concerned, where this guy came back to camp and to a bloody mess, and his buddy was dead, and they had been seeing this animal following them, that sort of thing. That is the only example that comes to mind. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
We have another one. Have you seen something like Bigfoot yourself?
Yeah, I was contemplating making a joke. I'm not going to. Um, but I don't believe I have ever laid eyes on a physical specimen. I do believe I have found physical evidence. And I'll just briefly tell that story. Two friends and myself, this would have been not this April, but last April. There was no snow on the ground here, so we thought, great, we wanted to go hike in this part of West Yellowstone. We went down there, and there was tons of snow down there. We weren't prepared for it. We found, and we followed for about 200 feet along the Madison River right before it empties into Hebgen. We found tracks that we followed that had crossed the Madison, walked on our side of the shore for about 200 feet, and then crossed again. They were about 17 inches long. They were definitively foot shaped, not snowshoe shaped, definitively foot shaped, and you could even see the toe impressions in most of them. And when we first saw those, I mean, like we were shocked. And after just checking them out for like 10-15 minutes, it's weird because it just became so normal. Like, oh look, here's another one. So when you hear about people finding a track, it's like, no, we found tracks that we followed. And even in that moment, I was forced to make the decision myself. Like, am I gonna send these in to someone? Am I gonna post these on the internet? All these sorts of things. And I decided, and I admittedly gave in to like, no, I don't think I want to do that again. But and maybe I was cowardly. But what would people think of me? You know, what would this do to my reputation? Whatever. You know. So that's anyway, and I have found a very interesting tree structure, which I didn't even mention in the talk. It's another whole part of the conversation, but apes are known to manipulate foliage for territory boundaries, stuff like that. Hunting up Bear Canyon several years ago, I found a really interesting tree structure, quite a bit off the trail, which most hoaxes are right near major roads and trails because they want to be seen. I was in a very dense part of the woods, found a really interesting tree structure. Basically, there were 6 about 20-foot lengths of lodgepole pine perfectly balanced on a broken over larger tree that was broken over about 3 feet high, and they were like perfectly balanced. It was weird. I mean, technically, I mean, a person could have done that, I guess. I don't know why in the world they would in such a remote. I mean, I was like, you know, beating my way through brush. It was not in a visible spot. So that one kind of intrigues me. But so I can't say as much about that. The footprints, though, I am convinced, and there are actually a lot of sightings that come out of Yellowstone and come out of the area. Yep.
So speaking to whether or not one should be found, do you think they should be kept in captivity if they were to be found?
Man, that enters into the world of opinion so much, and so I've never really thought about that. That's a really good question. But because I think it's important to point out that over the last 50 to 60 years, biology has gone through a major shift in how they think about this. It used to be that if you want to prove a species, you go out and shoot one and bring in a biological specimen, right? That used to be the name of the game. Not so much anymore. So that's a tough call. I think if it could, I would rather kind of identify an area, and I don't even know how feasible this would be. If you could identify an area where they live, I'd rather take measures to keep them there in a way that we could observe them, hopefully without necessarily bringing one into captivity. But then again, I'm hesitant to make a hard and fast my opinion on that. I don't know. I've never thought about that. So that's actually that's a really good question. And this is just me personally. I don't believe that they are. I don't believe that they are human. And I, you know, I'm like I said, I'm a hunter, so obviously I treat people like people and animals like animals. You know, don't be offended by that. That's how I was raised and how I live. But but I don't know. I'm not even prepared to answer that. That's a really good question. I think if it could be avoided, I'd probably prefer to avoid it, I guess, if that's a good enough answer. Yeah.
So we have another one, and I may mispronounce the name of this location here. It says the Dyatlov Pass incident is another
Yeah.
potential example of an aggressive Yeti. Do you know that story?
I do know that story, and I'm actually really glad that was brought up, because that's a great point. I love that story. You want to talk about mystery, and I don't even have time to rehash it here, but I personally, when you consider all the possibilities for what happened in the Dyatlov Pass incident, I personally think that a Yeti is the most believable solution to that whole mystery. I really do. When you consider all of the aspects, these people cut their way out of the tent from the inside. That tells me there was something at the front of the tent that was keeping them from leaving, right? The fact that they were found battered and these sorts of things. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, the Dyatlov Pass incident. That I'm really glad you brought that up. There's no shortage of documentaries and podcasts about that as well. Yeah, Google that. That's fascinating. And a lot of theorists are hesitant to even promote the Yeti theory with that. There's all sorts of lights in the sky theories, chemical warfare theories. Long and short of it is, like, 8 Russian mountaineer / hikers, college students, were on a huge trip. I believe in the 50s. They were found, and they never reported in. Search and rescue found them later, and they were all dead, and they had all fled their tent without any of their cold weather gear, and all their bodies were found dead in the surrounding area. And to this day, it's a cold case. No one knows exactly what happened. So a bunch of fascinating details surrounding that. But yeah, I think that's a valid point. Absolutely.
So that was our last question in the Q&A, but I have a question for you.
Sure.
And that's, so what we know about humans is, in general, they're very community-based. We're very tribal. But it seems like most evidence of Sasquatch and Bigfoots, they appear to occur kind of independently. Do you think this is a creature that has community, or something that is more solitary?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the evidence is actually kind of mixed there, and I probably should have brought that up sooner. A number of sightings are of groups, 2 or 3 at a time. There's actually some really great footage filmed from the Old Faithful live stream, like from 4 years ago in the dead of winter. You can see in the background like these 5 somethings. You can YouTube that as well. I do think that they are largely a community animal, actually. Even if sightings occur one at a time, and there's all kinds of theories about that in terms of how they function in a community, even maybe so sophisticated as to, like, almost post sentries on watch at, like, major, at the edge of a canyon or at the top of a mountain or whatever, so that if there's any danger or a person coming, they can basically signal to the others, and they can all kind of rendezvous and beat feet out of there, sort of thing. I do think that they're very clannish. I do think that they exist in families. Yeah. But like any other animal, I mean, wolves will kick out a rogue, wolf, and you see 2-year-old black bears, or year-and-a-half-old black bears that their mom just kicked them off, and so they're on their own for a while, that sort of thing. So I'm sure that's possible as well. Yeah.
All right. I think that was our last question. Is there anything you'd like to add to kind of close things off?
Not really. Again, my hope is just to get people from being totally skeptical to, hey, maybe this is a possibility. Everything I shared is largely introductory. There's no end of the rabbit holes. so use caution there. Don't end up in a basement with all the push pins and threads connecting and going weeks on end without showering. Don't do that. Keep living your life. But it is a fun hobby. And I just think that there's a lot more scientific credibility to it, maybe than most people would admit at first.
Oh, I might have something else in the Q&A. One more question in here. Do you know Don Monroe?
No, I don't know of Don Monroe, but I'll write that name down as well. I'm assuming that's someone I can Google.
I would make that assumption too. All right.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate it, anonymous attendee. Thank you.
All right. Well, if that is it, thank you everyone so much for attending. Thank you, Joel, so much for sharing the lore of Bigfoot. This has been so much fun. I'm excited to put some of these links and resources together and check them out myself too.
Great.
Carmen, do you have any closing words?
I just wanted to thank Joel. This was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for attending. I hope you learned something this evening. And there were lots of good things to follow up on. So we'll do that, and I'll check out to see, I'll see if we actually have that book in the library or not, so we'll take a look.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think there was just something else in the chat. So
You're welcome. Absolutely. It's my joy, man. Yeah, we can talk. Yeah, let's talk Bigfoot. I'm always down to talk Bigfoot. Yeah.
great. Awesome.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I did it at the same time. I was just thanking you so much for being here tonight.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. Thanks,
Have a good night, everyone.